Welcome to Hearthside Lore. Skaven. Introduction. The Skaven are a race of malevolent rat men that inhabit the underground of the Warhammer world. The tunnels of their vast under-empire reach from the steaming jungles of the Southlands to the snow-covered steppes of Kislev, from the western borders of Estalia and Bretonnia to the lost realms of the far east. Their capital is the mysterious city of Skavenblight, hidden in the center of the foul marshes lying on the western borders of Telea. There the mighty lords of decay, ruthless rulers of all Skaven, sit in the Council of 13, scheming and planning in preparation for the time when their armies will emerge from their subterranean realm to raise the entire surface world and rule over its ruins. This is the ultimate ambition of the Skaven race, a destiny which is preached by the Grey Seers, who are powerful wizards and prophets of the Horned Rat, the malevolent Skaven deity. Origins of the Skaven. Scholars and academics argue endlessly over the origins of the children of chaos known as the Skaven. Some maintain that they are simply a variant form of beastmen. Others insist that they are an entirely separate race, mutated not from men as beastmen are, but from true rats, while others still refuse to acknowledge their existence at all. Determining anything about Skaven is notoriously difficult. They are primarily a subterranean race, and usually only come to the surface during their violent and inexplicable wars. Perhaps the best clue to their creation lies in the ancient Telean folktale known as the Doom of Kavzar. The following is a broadly translated text of its 13 stanzas, and readers may draw their own conclusions. Once upon a time, long, long ago, men and dwarves lived together beneath the roofs of one great city. Some said it was the oldest and greatest city in the world, and had existed before the time of the Longbeards and Manlings, built by older and wiser hands in the dawn of the world. The city lay both above and below the earth, in keeping with the nature of the populace that dwelt there. The dwarves ruled in their great halls of stone below ground, and wrestled the fruits of the rock free with their day-long toil, while the manlings reaped the fields of swaying corn that surrounded the city with a patchwork blanket of gold. The sun smiled, men laughed, and everyone was happy. One day the men of the city decided that they should give praise to their gods for their good fortune. They planned a temple such as the world had never seen before. In the central square, a colossal hall would be built and topped with a single cloud-piercing tower. A tower so tall it would touch the very heart of heaven. After much planning, with the help of the Longbeards, they set about their monumental task. Weeks became months, and months became years, and still the manlings built. Men grew old and gray working on that temple, their sons continuing their work through summer sun and winter rain. At last, after many generations, work began on the great spire. Years passed, and the tower reached such a height that the manlings found it ever more difficult to take the stone up to the top. Eventually, the work slowed to a crawl, and finishing the tower seemed impossible. Then, one came among the men of the city who offered his help in their great scheme. He asked a single boon of them in return, and claimed that if they would grant it, he would complete the tower in a single night. The manlings said to themselves, "What have we to lose?" and offered to make a bargain with the gray-clad stranger. All he wished was to add his own dedication to the gods onto the temple structure. The manlings agreed, and the bargain was struck. At dusk, the stranger entered the unfinished temple and bade the manlings to return at midnight. Clouds swept over the moons, cloaking the temple in darkness as the manlings left. All over the city, men watched and waited as the hours slipped past, until, near midnight, by ones and twos, they gathered again in the temple square. The wind blew and the clouds parted as they gazed up at the temple. It rose like an unbroken lance against the sky, pure and white. At its very peak, a great horned bell hung gleaming coldly in the moonlight. The stranger's dedication to the gods was there, but of the stranger there was no sign. The manlings rejoiced that their father's work was done. They surged forward to enter the temple. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the great bell began to toll. Once, twice, thrice. Slow, heavy waves of sound rolled across the city. 4, 5, 6 times the bell rang, like the torpid pulse of a bronze giant. 7, 8, 9. The tolling of the bell grew louder with each ring, and the manlings staggered back from the temple steps, clutching their ears. 10, 11, 12, 13. At the 13th stroke, lightning split the skies and thunder echoed the sound. High above, the dark circle of Morzaleb was lit by a bright flash, and all fell ominously silent. The manlings fled to their beds, frightened and puzzled by the portents they had seen. Next morning they arose to find that darkness had come to their city. Brooding storm clouds reared above the rooftops, and such rain fell as had never been seen before. Black like ash the rain fell, and puddled in the streets, slicking the cobbles with darkly iridescent colors. At first, some of the manlings did not worry. They waited for the rains to stop so that they might resume their work. But the rains did not stop. The winds blew stronger, and lightning shook the high tower. Days stretched into weeks, and still the rains did not stop. Each night the bell tolled 13 times, and each morning the darkness lay across the city. The manlings became fearful and prayed to their gods. Still, the rains did not stop, and the black clouds hung like a shroud over the fields of flattened corn. The manlings went to the dwarves and beseeched their help. The Longbeards were unconcerned. What matter a little rain on the surface? In the bosom of the earth all was warm and dry. Now the manlings huddled in their dwellings, fear growing at their hearts. They sent some of their members to faraway places to seek help, but none of them returned. Some went to the temple to pray and sacrifice their dwindling food to the gods, but found that its great doors were sealed shut. The rains grew heavier. Dark hailstones fell from the sky and crushed the sodden crops. The great bell tolled a death knell over the terrified city. Soon great stones cleft the heavens, rushing down like dark meteors to smash the homes of the manlings. Many sickened and died from no apparent cause. and the newborn babes of the manlings were hideously twisted. Skulking vermin devoured what little stored corn there was left, and the manlings began to starve. The manling elders went to see the dwarves again, and this time demanded their help. They wanted to bring their folk below ground to safety. They wanted food. The Longbeards grew angry and told the manlings that the lower workings were flooded, and their food had also been devoured by rats. There remained barely enough food and shelter for them and their kinsmen. They cast the manlings out of their halls and closed their doors tight. In the ruins of the city above, each day became more deadly than the last. The manlings despaired and called for succor from the dark gods, whispered the names of forgotten demon princes in the hope of salvation. But none came. Instead, the vermin returned, bigger and bolder than ever. Their slinking furred shapes infested the broken city, feasting on the fallen and pulling down the weak. Each midnight, the bell tolled 13 times on high, seeming now brazen and triumphant. The manlings lived as hunted creatures in their own city, as great rat packs roamed the streets in search of prey. At last, the desperate manlings took up such weapons as they had and beat upon the dwarves' doors, threatening that if they did not emerge, they would drag them out by their beards. No reply came from within. The manlings took up beams and battered down the doors to reveal the tunnels below, dark and empty. Settling themselves, the pitiful remnants of the city's once proud populace descended. In the ancient hall of kingship they found the dwarves, now naught but gnawed bones and scraps of cloth, and there they saw, by the dying light of their torches, the myriad eyes about them, glittering the liquid midnight as the rats closed in for the kill. The manlings stood back to back and fought for their lives, but against the implacable ferocity and countless numbers of the verminous horde, their weapons were useless. The tide of monstrous rats flowed over them one by one, dragging them down to be torn apart, the yellow chisel teeth sinking into their soft flesh, the dark furred mass drowning their pitiful screams with their hideous chittering. Translated from the Chilean tale The Doom of Kavzar, also called The Curse of 13. From the shores of the northern Chilean Sea to the foot of the Black Mountains, a great morass of dismal marshland lies like a festering plague. This area is known as the Blighted Marshes, an ancient and terrible realm where death comes quickly to the unwary. A permanent reeking mist cloaks the deep black pools and slimy reed beds from view. Sluggish, muddy channels wind through the mire, maze-like and unfathomable, darkened on either bank by stretches of twisted stalks, which resemble nothing so much as corn blackened in a fire. In places, pools form, slickened with a dark iridescence where no living things grow. To enter the blighted marshes is to walk to your doom, inviting death in the bottomless murk of the jaws of the twisted beasts that legend has it dwell there. Few brave its terrors, for there are no tales of gold or hidden knowledge lying forgotten in its chill clutches to draw adventurers. Just black marsh reeking mist, and a lonely death. Few even dwell near it, for fear of the dark secrets it harbors. Andreas Camaras, Emeritus Professor of Imperial History, the Royal Academy of Altdorf. The Skaven. The Skaven hordes spread beneath the surface of the world like an evil plague, their empire spanning beneath continents and seas, lurking unseen under the feet of those they plot against. Masters of their underworld domain, they await the perfect moment to rise from the depths of their dark world and overwhelm the surface lands in an unstoppable tide. Skaven society is structured into a number of clans, which constantly vie with each other for preeminence. This political system is dominated by endless treachery, betrayal, labyrinthine plots, and scheming. Hence, Skaven as a whole are a necessarily paranoid race, their twisted minds unceasingly working to gain personal power. If a clan loses some of its influence and becomes vulnerable, it will be turned upon by other clans, which descend on its stronghold in a greedy frenzy. Skaven belonging to clans overcome in this fashion are enslaved by their vanquishers, spending the rest of their short lives chained in servitude to their new masters. The majority of the clans are Warlord Clans, and it is they who make up the vast bulk of Skaven armies. Within each of these Warlord Clans is a clear hierarchical ladder based on the law of strength and cunning. At the bottom of the heap are the slaves, including creatures of all races, though predominantly made up of the Skaven of fallen clans. Above the slaves are innumerable numbers of workers, making up the vast majority of the race's population. Of more importance, though fewer in number, are the clan rat warriors, the strongest and more conniving Skaven. At the pinnacle of each clan is the warlord, a particularly powerful, treacherous, and ruthless Skaven, who spends much of his time eliminating rivals and is constantly on the lookout for threats to his position. While this structure is very clear and defined, it is in no way fixed, and Skaven within a clan constantly plot and scheme in order to raise their own personal standing. Alliances are formed and broken, and superiors and rivals assassinated as the Skaven struggle for a higher position within the clan. This is the Skaven way, and an accepted, even respected, path for advancement. Warlord Nodwell of Clan Moors has recently become particularly powerful, having eliminated several of his closest rivals. He achieved this through countless assassinations, deceit, and at times outright war, earning Clan Moors the most fearful respect of the other clans. In one surprise attack, the water supply of a rival was tainted with a foul contagion purchased from Clan Pestilens. Warlord Nodwell marched with his clan rats into his rival's domain, trampling over countless poisoned corpses, and slaughtering those few who survived to claim the labyrinthine warren for his own. Clan Moors has had a great influx of new slaves, and gained significant wealth from its sudden rise in status. So much so that it is almost strong enough to rival the 4 greater clans from its stronghold in the City of Pillars. This could prove the downfall of Clan Moors, for the greater clans fiercely defend their positions and have in the past united to destroy a common foe. The four greater clans have complete ascendancy over the struggling masses of Skaven society, their influence far-reaching and supreme. Clan Pestilens is made up of the much-feared plague monks, festering disciples of disease and corruption, who have emerged as a powerful force from deep in the humid jungles of Lustria. Clan Moulder is a wealthy greater clan which uses the mutating effects of warpstone to create and breed an array of horrific fighting beasts. Clan Eshinn consists of stealthy spies and fearless assassins who hire out their services to other clans. Currently, the most powerful of the greater clans is Clan Skryre, whose members are known as warlock engineers, specializing in blending the arts of dark sorcery and science to produce their infamously destructive weapons. The entire Skaven population is ruled over by the Council of 13, also known as the 13 Lords of Decay. The council is formed of 11 warlords from the most powerful clans, including the 4 greater clans, 1 from the Order of the Mysterious Grey Seers, and is symbolically completed by the Horned Rat itself, the 13th member. The members of the Council of 13 are ancient, having held their seats of dominance for centuries, outliving countless generations, and guarding their positions jealously. The council is inevitably filled with its own intrigues and backstabbing, as each member seeks to raise his own status. The intention of the council is to unite the Skaven masses, to force them into working together towards a common goal. In reality, the council members are too caught up in their ever-shifting political intrigues to effectively unify the clans, though it is generally recognized that if the Skaven rose in a single great swarm, they would overwhelm the old world. So great are their numbers. The council routinely meets to organize and maintain coordination and some form of focus over the sprawling Skaven empire. These meetings take place in the great council chambers of the Horned Rat, hidden within the depths of Skavenblight, the despicable race's festering capital. Located within the near-impenetrable blighted marshes, Skavenblight is a sunken, labyrinthine city, rumored to be the birthplace of the unnatural race. Its deep, twisting tunnels and streets have been so extensively excavated and continually expanded that the true size of the city is unfathomable, spreading beneath the blighted marshes in all directions like a creeping plague. The squalor of the deepest levels of Skavenblight is filled with countless thousands of Skaven from the lesser Warlord Clans, their mercifully short lives filled with endless darkness and ever-present filth and disease, as well as the constant threat of cave-ins and enforced slavery from stronger clans. The adepts of Clan Eshinn are used by the council to enforce its will, hunting down and eliminating any who defy their supreme decrees, as well as any perceived threat to their position. When the Warlord Clan Makris quickly climbed in power, defying the edicts of the Lords of Decay, it was mercilessly butchered down to the last slave. Clan Eshinn adepts were dispatched in force, a score of assassins infiltrating the lair of Clan Makris and slaughtering its warlord and chieftains. Barricaded within their hold, the entire clan was massacred when Clan Moulder unleashed the full might of its power, loosing countless rat ogres and all manner of foul creatures upon them. The Grey Seers are the living prophets and intermediaries of the Horned Rat, interpreting his will and desires for the Skaven population. They advise and coerce the Warlord clans towards fulfilling the will of the Horned Rat, in accordance to their own interpretations, and act as intermediaries to relay the decrees of the Council to the Skaven clans. The leader of the Grey Seers, known as the Seer Lord, sits on the Council of 13, although this causes some resentment amongst the clans, who say that this compromises the intended role of the Grey Seers. The Grey Seers preach to the Skaven population of the time known as the Great Ascendancy, when the Skaven will rise as one, overwhelming the known world and gaining complete mastery over all races. Any who oppose the Grey Seers are denounced as heretics, acting against the will of the Horned Rat. Such a declaration is just the excuse that rival clans require to declare a sacred war on the condemned clan, and they will descend on it in a fury, backed up by the might of the Grey Seers and the Council itself. As such, the Grey Seers occupy a position of considerable influence and power. This does not stop the resentment felt by many important Skaven towards them, and it is a foolish Grey Seer indeed who does not watch his back when separated from his brethren. The Warlord Clans. Clan Rat Warriors. Clan Rat Warriors form the bulk of every Skaven army. On their own, Clan Rats are not exceptional fighters, lacking discipline and determination, but in large groups they are fearsome opponents. The presence of other Skaven around them greatly bolsters their morale, filling them with confidence and fueling their infamous ferocity. Storm Vermin. The fur of larger Skaven tends to be darker than normal, and for this reason black-furred Skaven are respected and feared by their brethren. These stronger, more vicious warriors are normally picked by the warlords to create units of elite storm vermin, better equipped than the rest of their comrades. On the battlefield, the storm vermin usually form the bodyguard of warlords and Grey Seers. Clan Rat Slaves. Masses of slaves are often pushed at the head of Skaven armies as a screen against missile fire, or to test the strength of the enemy. Skaven generals send them to be butchered without hesitation, and other Skaven do not care about their fate at all. Rat Swarms. Countless numbers of ravenous rats are attracted by Skaven armies and pose a dire threat for any enemy unlucky enough to cross their path. Clan Pestilens. The skink picked its way carefully toward the stepped pyramid that lay overgrown and half hidden beneath a sea of vegetation. It paused, listening for the raucous sound of birds that usually hung over the tropical land. There was nothing. The silence was unusual and menacing. Carefully, the skink began to climb the cracked stone steps, its head darting warily from side to side. From its vantage point, it could see others of its spawning stepping silently through the undergrowth below. As it neared the summit of the pyramid, it halted, looking down. The crest on its head changed from a dull green to a bright red, a warning signal to the Saurus marching through the undergrowth below. Sun gleamed off bright bronze armaments as the resplendent ranks of lizardmen came to a halt. Far in the distance, a lone monkey howled before absolute silence descended, as thick and heavy as the humid air itself. The blue-scaled skink stood motionless on the steps of the crumbling pyramid. glassy eyes fixed onto the spawning pool below. The water was foul and corrupted, its surface black and reeking of disease. Deformed, unborn creatures could be seen below the surface, frozen in their desperate struggle to break free from the poisonous fluids. Some had tried to emerge, their bodies locked in contorted death throes, filled with hatred and despair. The skink swung its gaze to the other spawning pools. They too were fetid, horribly contaminated by unholy poison. A strange sound emanated from the archway behind the skink, and its head came up sharply. The cold-blooded creature got a quick glimpse of movement, evil eyes and cracked yellow teeth partially hidden beneath tattered robes before the heavy flail, trailing coiling green smoke, impacted with its head. Bone shattered, and the skink was thrown off the stepped pyramid, landing heavily a dozen steps below before continuing to tumble to the base. Bloody and broken, its body landed in the midst of the motionless column of lizardmen. The saurus raised their heavy heads towards the overgrown pyramid above them. The sound of claws scratching against stone carried across the heavy air, and an unending swarm of small, pallid shapes could be seen pushing from the deep cracks and fissures in the ancient pyramid structure. Countless thousands of clawing vermin, their fur patchy and diseased, descended the pyramid in a living tide. They swarmed over the lizardmen who swatted at the scurrying creatures with heavy talons, the plagued rodents climbing thick scaled legs, biting frantically and flowing around the saurus. Several of the powerful lizardmen were swept to the ground and were quickly lost from sight, covered by the frenzied vermin. Dark figures could be seen scrambling from within the ancient structure, emerging from the shadowed doorways at the top of the pyramid. Screaming incoherently, the robed plague monks hurled themselves down the steps toward the lizardmen, their tattered robes flowing behind them like ragged wings. The plague monks leapt off the pyramid steps, their blackened claws outstretched towards the saurus warriors. The faces of the Skaven were foul and diseased, their fur matted and patchy, eyes milky and filled with repugnant sickness. Their expressions were twisted into visages of madness and hatred. They impacted against the burly saurus figures with tremendous force, bowling many of them into their comrades behind. The plague monks lashed out around them in their frenzy, not caring who they struck, friend or foe, eyes wild and foam dripping from the corners of their mouths. Teeth, claws, and serrated blades slashed left and right, ripping at both tough lizardman hides and softer furred flesh. The saurus bellowed in rage, striking out with their primitive weapons and snapping bones in their vice-like jaws. A towering Kroxigor roared its outrage as it stomped its heavy feet into the scurrying vermin, raising its heavy obsidian axe over its head. It swept the weapon down in a vicious arc, smashing a plague-ridden Skaven into the lush earth. A wicked blade was plunged into its leg, and the huge lizardman snarled, dropping its weapon. Turning with surprising swiftness, it grabbed the Skaven who was trying to wrench its blade from the creature's thigh. Hefting the Skaven into the air, the Kroxigor slammed the twisted creature into the ancient pyramid, spattering gore across the pale stone. Countless blades slashed at the thick skin of the Kroxigor, and it swung around, heavy fists crunching bone as they struck twisted Skaven bodies. Thick green smoke descended around the lizardmen formation as a group of fanatical censer bearers threw themselves from a stone platform above, smashing into the ranks of Saurus. Several of the burly Saurus sank to the ground, gasping for air as the burning fumes were inhaled deeply into their lungs. A heavy spiked ball, oozing the evil smoke, smashed into the Kroxigor's cheekbone, knocking the creature to one side. Shaking its head briefly, it turned to face its assailant. Half of the lizardman's face was blistering and liquefying, its eye turning into a sickening pale color. It bared its teeth, grabbing the frenzied Skaven in its powerful arms. Plunging its head downwards, the Kroxigor clamped its jaws onto the plague monk's neck, wrenching away a huge chunk of flesh in a spray of blood and fur. The Kroxigor spat out the foul meat, blood dripping between its teeth. Another plague censer was swung at the Kroxigor, striking heavily at the immense creature's knee. Its leg buckled beneath it, and a swarm of Skaven leapt atop the falling lizardman, their blades rising and falling in a bloody fury. Still, the creature struggled, choking the life out of another plague monk, crushing his neck in one huge hand. Frantically, the Skaven hacked at the Kroxigor until it was awash in dark blood. But still the creature held to its grip, even in death. The plague monks quickly overran the surviving Saurus warriors as more of the crazed Skaven emerged from the darkness within the pyramid, hacking apart the lizardman corpses after they had fallen. One of the Skaven raised his voice to a high-pitched chant as he held a jagged knife in both hands high above his head. The last of the Saurus beneath him. A hoarse shout cut through the crazed plague monk's frenzy, and he paused, blinking his eyes. A hunched and heavily robed figure hobbled forwards, a twisted staff clutched tightly in his decaying, shaking fingers. Again he shouted at the plague monk, sickly spittle spraying from its mouth, and the Skaven backed away from the intended victim. At the Skaven's impatient motions, several plague monks leapt forward to pin the powerful Saurus's limbs. The lizardman glowered up at the heavily cloaked plague priest standing over it, a dull growl echoing from within its barreled chest. Fumbling with a dark, musty pouch, the plague priest pulled out a white rat, its eyes oozing foul fluids. The Skaven patted the rat lovingly as it squirmed in his hands. Barking another order, the plague monks tightened their grip on the Saurus, bones creaking. The plague priest knelt over the lizardman, holding the rat towards it. The Saurus snapped its jaws at the rodent, and the plague priest pulled his pet back protectively. The plague priest stroked the rat lovingly, shuffling closer. Holding the rodent firmly, the decaying Skaven priest dug a cracked black claw deep into its mangy body. The rat squealed in distress, and its owner thrust it towards the lizard man again. The rat struggled as it was squeezed painfully, just out of reach of the snarling Saurus. Corrupt, diseased blood dripped from the rat into the open mouth of the lizard man. Satisfied, the plague priest stood, shoving the limp body of the rat back into a pouch. With an affectionate pat, he motioned, and the plague monks raised the lizard man to its feet. Raising a cudgel, a Skaven clubbed the lizard man heavily across the back of its head, and it collapsed, unconscious, to the ground.
"Go, lizard thing. Take our precious yellow skull fever back to your brood den."
A gurgling laugh bubbled within the plague priest's chest as he turned and stalked away, leaning heavily on his crooked staff. Clan Pestilens troops. Centuries ago, a Skaven expedition ventured into the steaming jungles of Lustria, only to be decimated by virulent tropical diseases and the reptilian warriors that defend the land. The few survivors, led by a warlord whose name is lost in the mists of time, hid in the ruins of a temple they had discovered in the depths of the jungle. There they had unearthed ancient secrets, which should have been left forever undisturbed. Perhaps it was because of the knowledge they chanced upon, or perhaps their destiny was decreed by the horned rat. But these Skaven mysteriously began to revere the very diseases that were slowly killing them. A strange new breed of Skaven was born, the plague monks of Clan Pestilens. Constantly plague-ridden, they were capable of withstanding their diseases as long as they remained devoted to their festering god. Soon the plague monks started to expand, and their delirious ferocity became legendary among their enemies. The first to suffer at their hands were the lizardmen. Several of their cities were wiped out by lethal plagues, until powerful magic unleashed by the Slann forced Clan Pestilens to retreat. The majority of the plague monks abandoned Lustria and escaped to the Southlands, where they settled in the dark rainforests. From there, they started to move north, spreading disease in their wake, until they reached the old world. When their emissaries reached Skavenblight, contact with their long-lost brethren was re-established. At first, they were refused a seat in the Council of 13, which resulted in a bitter civil war. The power of the Plague Lords, supported by those clans that did not agree with the policies of the Council, almost triumphed over the Lords of Decay. The Skaven population was devastated by the war and pestilence unleashed by the plague monks in their wrath. Finally, the Lords of Decay agreed that the Plague Lords had proved their right to have a seat on the council, and Clan Pestilens agreed to put its powers at the service of the 13. Plague Priests. The Plague Priests are the leaders of the dreaded Clan Pestilens. They spend their time celebrating the rituals of the Horned Rat in his aspect of harbinger of disease, and researching newer and deadlier plagues to unleash on the surface world. The hideous utensils which they use for their unholy work are known as cauldrons of 1,000 poxes, artifacts reeking of evil, within which they brew their fetid, bubbling concoctions of unspeakable foulness. Plague Monks. Plague monks form the bulk of Clan Pestilens' troops. They wear tattered robes and bandages to hide their horribly bloated, sore-covered bodies. So used are they to living with constant pain that they are impervious to it, and must be literally chopped to pieces before they stop fighting with their characteristic fanatical zeal. The putrid stench and swarms of flies that always surround them are a feared sign of the presence of these acolytes of pestilence on the battlefield. Plague censer bearers. Only the most deranged and fanatical worshippers of disease are chosen for the honor of carrying a plague censer. These weapons are flails, whose spiked heads are filled with burning warp stone incense. On the battlefield, groups of censer bearers advance in front of larger units of plague monks, reciting the Liturgicus Infecticus. When the enemy is in sight, they charge, swinging their heavy censers. The cloud of poisonous gas that enshrouds them as they fight often proves as fatal to the censer bearers themselves as to their enemies. However, this is no deterrent to these lunatics, who scream prayers of thanks to the horned rat, even as they die with their lungs filled with a foul mixture of blood and pus. Plague rat swarms. The evil adepts of Clan Pestilens use rats as vessels of contagion to spread their lethal diseases. These animals are infected with one of the concoctions created by the plague priests and released into a city's sewers. There they contaminate the local rat population, which passes the diseases on to the inhabitants. Anyone bitten by one of these creatures will succumb to the virulent fever they carry. Clan Eshinn. Warlord Snicket strode into his refuse-strewn den and threw his shield to the ground, startling several rats that fled into the cracks in the walls. His heavy rusted armor was stained with blood, and he chittered to himself in barely contained excitement. The day had been his. He had led the raiding party deep into the heart of his rival's territory, fatally crippling Clan Festus. He knew that even now the other warlords would be descending on the survivors, picking the now vulnerable clan to pieces like carrion. As the Skaven leader basked in the glory of his perfectly executed victory, a shadow separated itself from the ceiling, dropping to land silently behind him, melding once again into the gloom. Snicket's broken and torn whiskers twitched, and he turned his head suspiciously towards the darkness. His eyes widened in surprise as the shadow stared back at him, red eyes glowing like hellish coals in the darkness. In a blur of movement, a black-clad figure leapt towards the warlord, dragging the shadows behind it like a cloak. Dark, bladed claws, bound to the creature's hands, slashed viciously through the air, and Snicket threw himself backward to avoid the blows that would have opened his belly. Glaring at the assassin contemptuously, Snicket drew his serrated blade, baring his sharp yellow teeth. His body and face wrapped tightly in black cloth, the assassin stepped forward slowly, each step perfectly balanced and silent. Darkness coiled around him like a living creature, and Snicket's head hurt to watch the deadly foe. Snarling, the warlord lunged forwards, his heavy blade descending towards the assassin's head. The blow was swatted aside, and the assassin launched a lightning counter-attack that scratched 3 lines of red blood across Snicket's face, barely missing his eye. The assassin stepped back, satisfaction gleaming in his cruel gaze. Warlord Snicket felt his face beginning to go numb, and fear coursed through him. He could feel the poison pumping through his system, working its way towards his heart, and his vision began to swim. With desperate strength, Snicket lurched towards the assassin, who dropped into a crouch, his fighting claws moving menacingly before him. Snicket launched into a series of swift attacks, each turned aside by the assassin, who moved with preternatural speed and finesse. The assassin caught the warlord's blade between the claws on one of his hands and snapped it with a sharp blow with the palm of his other. Stepping in close to the black-clad figure, the larger Skaven struck upwards with the hilt of his sword, a sharp crack sounding as the blow struck the Clan Eshinn adept's jaw. The assassin reeled backwards from the powerful blow, and Snicket, pulling a long dagger from its sheath, swiftly closed on the stunned figure. Recovering quickly, the assassin swayed to the side, the slashing blade passing scant inches from his neck. Lashing out deftly, the assassin caught Snicket's arm as it passed, twisting it sharply. A sequel of pain erupted from Snicket's throat as his shoulder was wrenched from its socket, and he dropped his dagger to the floor. The assassin punched upwards, the palm of his hand landing sharply against the warlord's overextended elbow joint. A shriek of pain followed the sickening crunch that sounded loudly through the room, and the warlord's arm fell limply to his side. Mad with pain, Snicket latched into the assassin's scrawny neck, his dirty broken nails cutting into the black-furred throat. The assassin struggled frantically, but could not break from the warlord's powerful grip. With a feral snarl, the enraged Skaven warlord lunged forwards, his sharp yellow teeth flashing towards the assassin's face. Struggling desperately, his eyes filled with horror, the assassin turned his face away from the savage attack. Snicket's teeth sank into the side of the black-garbed figure's face, tearing viciously at the flesh. Snicket snarled again, spitting blood from his mouth, his eyes wild with fury and pain. Lifting the assassin by the throat, he slammed the black-clad figure brutally into the wall. There was a sharp crack as ribs shattered. The assassin slid to the ground, gasping for breath. Snicket bent to the floor, picking up a heavy, partially gnawed bone, and hefted it menacingly, staring balefully down at the broken assassin.
Fools! Fools! Think mighty Lord Snicket could be taken so easily, they do.
The warlord stiffened suddenly, his eyes widening in disbelief. Blood rose from his throat in a gurgling froth. A second assassin wrenched his dark, serrated blade from the warlord's back. The blood on the assassin's dagger mixed with the foul greenish liquid seeping from the blade and dripped, hissing, to the floor. The heavily armored Skaven fell. Staring blindly at the dark ceiling, Warlord Snicket lay on his back, his tail twitching as his body went into a series of convulsions. The assassin drew back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness once more. For a moment, their eyes could still be seen glowing malevolently, before they, too, vanished from sight. Clan Eshinn troops. Clan Eshinn disappeared into the east early in Skaven history, and had been considered lost for many centuries. When its members returned to Skaven Blight, they were changed. During that long period in contact with the mysterious human cultures of India, Cathay, and Nippon, the Skaven had learned much, especially about the arts of stealth and assassination. From then on, Clan Eshinn has found a clear role in Skaven society. Its assassins have become the force which the Council of 13 uses to uphold its decisions and maintain its reign of terror among the clans. Of course, the services of Clan Eshinn are often hired by many other influential Skaven to spy on their rivals, or to remove political opponents who are too successful. Assassins. The assassins are the masters of the secret lethal arts of Clan Eshinn. They have the reputation of being able to turn invisible, appearing from the shadows only to deliver poisoned death to their destined victims. Night Runners. These units of fast skirmishers are notorious These units of fast skirmishers are notorious for the low survivability of their troops. This is the Eshinn way to ensure that only the worthy make it to the ranks of the gutter runners. Gutter runners. Gutter runners are skilled at infiltrating behind enemy lines, scouting ahead of the main Skaven force, and hiding in a position that will allow them to jump out at the right moment to ambush the crew of enemy war machines, or to cut down wizards or enemy officers. Sometimes these stealthy fighters use the tunnels that make up the labyrinthine Skaven under-empire to make an unexpected attack on the vulnerable rear of an enemy force. Clan Moulder.
"Forwards! Only one left! Get it! Get it!"
screamed the pale-furred Master Moulder, gesturing wildly towards the blood-drenched, heavily armored figure. The vampire stood in the center of the courtyard, surveying his surroundings coldly. His sword, dripping with blood and gore, was held relaxed in one heavily mailed hand. The entire keep seethed with life, Skaven scrambling over each other in a roiling, hateful mass, pushing towards him from all sides. Huge rats the size of wolves erupted through the sewer gates, pushing into the overrun keep. They were twisted creatures, their form perverted through countless unspeakable experiments. Great spines of bone protruded through matted fur, while others of these giant vermin had multiple limbs roughly grafted onto their torsos, and long metal claws attached to their paws. One had a grimacing, distorted face erupting from its side. Another had a scaled tail hanging limply behind it, oozing black foulness. The vampire frowned as another disturbing mutation pushed itself forwards. A human head had been roughly sewn to a giant rat body. The face twitched and gibbered uncontrollably, its tongue hanging loosely from its gaping mouth. A Skaven raised a cruelly barbed whip, lashing out at his giant rat charges. The spikes tore into the monstrous rodents' backs, and they leaped forwards in a wild frenzy. Matching their savage attack with unmatched skill and power, the undead warrior hacked his weapon through fur, flesh, and bone with ease. He cut a bloody swath around him, reveling in the bloodshed. The dead were piled thickly around the blood dragon's legs, yet his unliving body showed no sign of fatigue. A whip lashed out, wrapping around the vampire's arm. With a snarl, he wrenched on the weapon brutally, pulling the Skaven off its feet towards him. The packmaster died, coughing blood, as it was impaled on the blood dragon's blade. Again the Skaven drew back, not wishing to get within killing range of the deadly warrior. They crushed bones beneath their clawed feet, the remnants of the keep's defenders, their spirits free after centuries of servitude. Seeing a pale-furred Skaven towards the rear who acted like a leader, directing the creatures around it with a cruel whip, the vampire leveled his sword in that direction, his eyes filled with menace. He had seen the last of his brethren dragged under the press of foul rat beings, their immortal lives cut short by these sickening creatures. His voice echoed ominously through the keep. "A challenge. Step forth, creature, and meet my blade in combat." The Master Moulder looked at the armored figure in shock, his eyes wide. The vampire radiated strength and power, a menacing tall figure drenched in blood. The Skaven fingered his whip nervously, feeling the eyes of his brood on him waiting for his reaction. Silence settled over the keep, and he shrank under the vampire's gaze. A feral glint touched the Skaven's eyes, and he glared at his enemy. Turning his head, the Skaven shrieked in his obscene language into the darkness behind him. A trio of hulking forms moved towards the flickering light of the torches, their massive shoulder muscles rippling and flexing. They stepped into the light, and the rat ogre's lips drew back to reveal immense, rotting teeth. Rough stitching covered their bodies. Some areas of flesh were scaled, others furred, the whole image being that of a nightmarish patchwork monstrosity. One of the beasts had sheets of rusted metal haphazardly riveted into its flesh. A thick stream of drool dripped from its powerful jaw. Another had had its forearm amputated, and a series of crude blades hammered into the stump. A blood-soaked bandage wrapped around the wound. Chunks of glowing warpstone replaced its eyes, the skin around the sockets blistering and weeping. The eyes of the other two creatures were small and burned red, unintelligent, and full of barely checked fury. The Master Moulder grabbed the heavy chain around the neck of one of the beasts, pulling it hard. The mutated creature growled dangerously, and the Skaven raised a scarred hand, pointing at the vampire. The rat ogres turned their gaze as one towards the defiant figure, their growls rumbling deep in their massive chests. They took a menacing step forwards.
"Challenge, strong clan Moulder, dead thing? Accept your challenge, I do."
The three monsters pounced forwards, their speed seeming at odds with their overwhelming bulk. They moved straight towards the blood dragon, who stood in a relaxed combat stance, supremely confident of his abilities. The vampire stepped forwards to meet the rat ogres head-on, ducking below a lethal swipe with preternatural speed, slashing his immense ornate broadsword across the creature's belly. It roared in outrage and pain as dark blood pumped from the wound, guts spilling to the cobbled ground. It sank to its knees, its lifeblood pooling around it. A massive fist punched towards the blood dragon, who swept his weapon down with tremendous force to meet the attack. The mighty arm was severed at the elbow, the twisted creature roaring in pain. With a lightning move, the vampire reversed his blow and thrust his sword up through the beast's throat, pushing it forcefully until the point exploded from the back of its neck, stuck fast. The monstrous creature grabbed its adversary by the shoulder, claws almost a foot long pushing through his ornate armor, and hurled him across the courtyard. The vampire smashed heavily into a stone parapet, a blow that would have broken the bones of any mortal being. Rising into a crouch, the undead knight's face twisted into a vicious snarl, his long black hair hanging wildly before his eyes. As the warpstone-eyed rat ogre thundered towards him, the blood dragon leapt from the ground towards the huge monster, landing with vice-like hands clutched to its thick neck. Plunging his sharp canines into the side of the creature's neck, the vampire savagely ripped its throat out with a vicious twist. The monstrosity fell to the ground heavily, and the blood dragon turned towards the Skaven leader, streams of dark blood gushing from his mouth. The Skaven's heart began to beat wildly, and it began to push back frantically through the press of Skaven, seeking to put as many of his minions between him and the avenging vampire that began to stalk steadily towards him. A towering shape loomed up behind the vampire, A huge taloned hand closed around the warrior's head, lifting the struggling figure high into the air. With a gurgling roar, ornate sword still embedded in its throat, the rat ogre smashed the vampire's head into the ground with brutal force. Time and time again, the wounded monster pounded the blood dragon into the cobbled courtyard until his head was little more than a bloody pulp. The Skaven horde sprung forwards, swarming over the vampire and tearing him limb from limb in a gory frenzy. The rat ogre fell to its knees, pawing weakly at the sword in its throat. The Skaven leader turned to its subordinate, pointing towards the dying creature.
"Take it to the pens. Stitch it up quick, quick. This one shows great promise."
Clan Moulder troops. Clan Moulder has its stronghold in the depths of Hell Pit, far north of Prague, in the land called Kislev by its human inhabitants. Its proximity to the northern wastes, together with the huge reserves of warp stone in its mines, make Hell Pit a nightmarish receptacle for the mutating energies of chaos. The masters of Clan Moulder have learned the art of controlling these mutations, and use them to create ferocious fighting beasts in foul experiments that combine mad surgery and the darkest of magics. The Packmasters capture many different animals and monsters from the lands south of Hell Pit, but most of their subjects come from the savage northern wastes and the dangerous troll country. They study the creatures they capture and experiment on them with feverish imagination. Often they crossbreed these monstrosities in an attempt to create new specimens, which carry the most dangerous traits of both species involved. Other times they try direct implementation of severed organs and limbs. All these experiments involve the use of their infamous mutating bombs that contain finely powdered warpstone to focus the mutating energies of chaos on the unfortunate creatures. These foul oils make even the most extreme changes possible, allowing Clan Moulder to violate the laws of nature in their unholy quest to make the ultimate fighting beast. Clan Moulder sells its creatures to all Warlord Clans, and is therefore a much respected and sought-after ally for the ever-warring Skaven. Master Moulders. Mutated by many years of exposure to large amounts of warpstone, the Master Moulders are disturbing creatures. They sometimes appear on the battlefield to inspect the impact of their creations and find inspiration on how to make them even more deadly. Their presence instills a great deal of fear and discipline in their minions, and even the most powerful rat ogres shy away from these vicious Skaven. A clear testament to their great skill at inflicting pain on all living creatures. Packmasters. The Packmasters goad packs of Clan Moulder war beasts into the ranks of the enemy. They are notorious for their skill in the use of the whip, a weapon that they learn to use with unparalleled ability. The Packmasters' intelligence, coupled with their creatures' ferocity, are an extremely dangerous combination on the battlefield. Giant rats. Clan Moulder has grown these horrible rat beasts to the size of wolves, retaining their ferocity and everlasting hunger. Relatively easy to breed, these are the cheapest beasts for the Warlord Clans to buy from Clan Moulder, and are therefore quite a common sight in Skaven armies. A seething mass of stinking fur and sharp fangs, these creatures can overwhelm even the most disciplined enemies. Rat ogres. Rat ogres are the masterpiece of Clan Moulder's mad research. They are massive, hulking monsters, created from a warped mix of different creatures. Only the strongest rat ogres survive the terrible conditions that pack masters impose on them from birth, forcing them to compete for food and shelter. The ones that survive to maturity are little more than a mass of sinewy muscles and razor-sharp claws, moved only by their strong instinct to kill, and completely dependent on the packmaster for guidance. Clan Skryre. The warlock engineer stood motionless, his eyes filled with malevolent amusement as the screams of the dying echoed up the dark passage. Chieftain Skryre of Clan Liskit glanced nervously towards the figure standing at his side, as the rival clan attacked once more. Skryre found his gaze unconsciously drawn once again to his clan Skryre ally's left arm. The hand had been roughly severed, replaced by an arcane-looking pronged device. Strange green-tinged electricity danced over its dark blades, lighting the darkness. From his position atop the rough barricade, the chieftain could see the enemy clan rats swarming up the dark, circular tunnel. They moved as an unstoppable wave, overrunning the defenders below through sheer weight of numbers. Skryre looked around hurriedly for an escape route, for the living tide of Skaven would surely smash aside the hastily erected Clan Liskit defenses. The arcane scientist twisted a few knobs built into his arm, and a humming sound erupted from the arcane machinery worn on his back. Skryre backed slowly away from the warlock as he felt the air fill with barely controlled energy, making his fur stand on end and his whiskers twitch uncomfortably. As the warlock thrust his arm over the barricade, energy began to course through his form. His body acted as a living conduit for the arcane power that suddenly erupted from the blades embedded in his arm. Green lightning sprang from the tips of the bizarre contraption, arcing down into the sea of brown fur scampering towards the barricade. The lightning split into a number of contorting arcs of light, passing through Skaven and striking those behind, while other tendrils of power earthed harmlessly into the stone floor. Clan rats convulsed in their death throes as energy coursed through their bodies. With a sharp twist of another knob, the energy flowing through the warlock came abruptly to a halt. His body continued to tremble with the aftermath of the power, and sparks flashed around his eyes. He shook his head, dissipating the last of the energy. Flickering sparks danced over the fetid water pooling on the ground below before they, too, died out. Still, the wave of Skaven scampered up the passageway, trampling those killed by the techno-sorcery of Clan Skryre beneath countless clawed feet. A quick glance was exchanged between the warlock and the chieftain as they turned as one, leaping from the barricade into the refuse below their position. They scurried across the ground until they reached the massed ranks of the Clan Liskit warriors. Behind the two fleeing Skaven, the barricade was quickly overrun, the raiders clambering over each other, their cruel blades clamped tightly between their teeth. Turning his head, the engineer motioned forwards with his one heavily gloved hand. From out of the gloom, a large shape rolled forwards, an unearthly green glow pulsing from within. A pair of misshapen Skaven pushed the wheeled contraption forwards, their milky eyes staring blindly forwards. The chieftain watched the ungodly clan Skryre war machine as it was heaved between ranks of the clan rats. The Skaven scrambling over each other to keep away from the glowing contraption. The warlock's eyes lit up with an insane gleam. The assaulting Skaven swarmed down the passage, packing the circular tunnel with their overwhelming numbers. The engineer turned his mad gaze on Skryre.
"Send in your slaves now. Quick, quick."
Bobbing his head in response, the chieftain barked his orders at his subordinates, gesturing wildly at the approaching Skaven. With the crack of whips, the slaves were led forwards, their emaciated bodies covered in weeping sores and whiplashes. Heavy brass collars bound their scrawny necks, and the clinking of rustling chains echoed through the corridor as they shuffled forwards. The slaves, Skaven captured on one of Clan Lisket's many raids, were whipped forwards until they stood before the tide of invading clan rats. The enemy smashed into the slaves in a fury, carving through their ranks with ease. Many of the slaves turned to flee, panic washing over them. But they were whipped and struck from those behind who urged them ever forwards. Caught between these two forces, the slaves were being ripped limb from limb and trampled beneath the surging crowd. The warlock engineer nodded to the Skaven standing atop the bizarre clan Skryre contraption. Raising a paw to his arcane goggles, the engineer tapped a button on his temple, and a pair of mirrored lenses flicked down to cover his eyes. Skryre stood uncomprehending, watching as a lever was clicked forwards on the immense arcane creation. A sudden surge of painful light filled the dark corridor, and Skaven dropped to the ground, clutching at their burning eyes. The warlock smirked behind his protective goggles as a wave of heat washed over him. A huge, twisting bolt of green-tinged light erupted from the barrel of the warp cannon, shooting forwards into the mass of tightly packed Skaven, bouncing around the corridor and enveloping all in its path. The Skaven slaves and enemy clan rats were engulfed as one of the contorting bolts punched searing holes through all in its path. Smaller green arcs separated from the main beam, leaping around the corridor in a frenzied dance of devastation. Lunging from one Skaven to another, the surge of energy struck the barricade, splintering the rotting wood that exploded outwards under the intense force. The bolt continued up the corridor, bouncing along the halls into the distance, and darkness descended once more. The corridor floor was strewn with twitching, furred bodies, innumerable Skaven figures lying broken and burnt, and the whimpers of the dying cut through the unearthly silence. The foul smell of burnt flesh and fur filled the corridor as the warlock engineer turned to Chieftain Skryre, who cowered on his knees in the filth, paws clutched tightly over his aching eyes.
"Price for aid of almighty Clan Skryre most agreeable. Yes, yes."
Clan Skryre troops. Clan Skryre specializes in the blending of evil magic and arcane Skaven technology. Its members, better known as warlock engineers, constantly experiment to create newer and more powerful weapons of mass destruction. They often steal war machines from other races, and then strive to improve them in their own unique way. This almost invariably involves the inclusion of warpstone-based mechanisms that increase the weapon's potential for destruction, but also tend to make them much more unstable. Other races would consider such weapons far too dangerous for large-scale use on the battlefield. But Skaven have a different attitude, normally accepting a few losses from their own weapons as normal. After all, that's what slaves are for. The most recent addition to Clan Skryre's arsenal is the powerful Warp Lightning Cannon. This bizarre gun is powered by a huge chunk of raw warpstone. Its magical energy is channeled through a series of lenses that amplify and concentrate it. When the weapon is fired, a bright green bolt of lightning surges from the weapon's muzzle, powerful enough to shatter mountains. At least in theory. By selling the services of their specialized weapon teams to the constantly warring clans, the masters of Clan Skryre have achieved an unparalleled level of influence, and are, at the moment, the most important of the 4 greater clans. Warlock Engineers. These techno-mages are equipped with complex harnesses that allow them to visualize the ever-mutating winds of magic, so that they can tap into the flow of power and use its energy for their powerful, destructive spells. Warplock Jezzails. Jezzail teams consist of 2 Skaven, one armed with a long-barreled rifle, and the other carrying a shield that he props up to defend the team, and to present a firm point to rest the weapon on. The Jezzail fires bullets of refined warpstone that explode on impact, making a mockery of the thickest armor. Poisoned Wind Globadiers. Globadiers are highly specialized troops, armed with deadly poisoned wind globes. These fragile spheres of glass are filled with toxic warpstone-derived fumes, produced by the Warlock engineers in their secret laboratories. Small groups of globadiers can often be found scuttling on the flanks of Skaven armies, lobbing their grenades against knights and other elite units, whose armor is no defense at all. Weapon teams. Teams of 2 Skaven armed with rattling guns and warp-fire throwers often follow units of clan rats, supporting them with their lethal firepower. Warp Lightning Cannon. The Warp Lightning Cannon is crewed by 2 slaves, who provide the muscular power needed to move the gun around, and by a Skryre adept, who orders the slaves around and fires the gun. The magical energy of the warpstone powering the gun is also used by the Skryre adept to strengthen the slaves, giving them enough muscle to move and spin around the heavy machine with ease. The unfortunate side effects of this exposure to raw warpstone energy mean that the slaves normally survive for less than a day. Just long enough. The Screaming Bell. Screaming bells are unholy altars from which the Grey Seers preach to the Skaven. The bell is an ever-present symbol in the legends describing the creation of the Skaven race, and its sound reaches deep inside the evil hearts of the rat men, inspiring awe and devotion. In battle, the ominous sound of the bell can be heard above the clamor of the fighting, a message of death for the rat men's enemies, and of victory for the Skaven. A writing from Hieronymus Boschus. The Lord Sigmar send me visions of hell. I see gigantic treadmills eternally turning in the dark. I see uncountable masses of swarming vermin standing on their hind legs. in a foul parody of man. I see diabolic machines made by deranged mutants. I see bloated queens with atrophied limbs breeding their rotten offspring. All this I see, and in my head the dreadful tolling of the cursed bells still screams. It won't stop. The multitude of red eyes stare at us from the darkness of sewers and graves. They loathe us, and they will rise to devour us all for our sins. Make it stop. Please, make it stop. Masters of the Under Empire. Though a short-lived race, some Skaven have had their existence unnaturally extended by the mutating effects of warpstone. Outliving their brethren by countless generations, these Skaven have proved themselves to be particularly dangerous, insidious, and conniving to have survived for so long in Skaven society. Admirable qualities for the Skaven. Icket Claw, Chief Warlock of Clan Skryre. Icket Claw is the Chief Warlock of Clan Skryre, second within the clan only to the venerable Lord Morskatar himself. His skills at molding tech science and sorcery are unparalleled within all of Clan Skryre. His insanely brilliant mind constantly coming up with new and bizarre weapons of destruction. Icket Claw has had much of his body enhanced with warpstone-powered mechanics of his own design, including a powerful claw, incorporating a potent warp fire projector. The Chief Warlock has been enjoying his position of preeminence within Clan Skryre, which continues to grow in power. His most recent creation is the Warp Lightning Cannon, a potent weapon that focuses the power of a powerful chunk of warpstone into a devastating bolt of corrupting energy. Deathmaster Snikch, Chief Assassin of Clan Eshinn. Deathmaster Snikch is the infamous Chief Assassin of Clan Eshinn, and right hand of his master, the Dread Night Lord. He is the most feared and successful Skaven assassin of all time. The mere mention of the Deathmaster causes the musky smell of fear to rise from the Skaven masses, for no one is safe from his reach, no matter where they are, or how well protected. His shadowy presence is often felt, though almost never seen, and the number of clan warlords who have fallen beneath his weeping blades are countless. Innumerable assassinations all across the old world and beyond have been attributed to him. In recent years, the mysterious slaying of the dwarf lord Dolthordan, found locked within his chamber with his throat slit, despite his near impenetrable stronghold teeming with his bodyguard of hammerers, was said to have been the work of the Deathmaster. An almost supernatural figure, Snikch strikes from the darkness before disappearing once more, his victims the only evidence of his passing. Lord Skrolk, Plague Lord of Clan Pestilens. Lord Skrolk is a favored devotee of the Horned Rat, and the prime agent of the Arch-Plague Lord of Clan Pestilens. Corrupted and bloated, Lord Skrolk's flesh hangs in rotting tatters over his bones, and his eyes are oozing empty sockets. His putrescent body is so vilely potent that only his brother plague monks can approach him in relative safety. His knowledge of the virulent diseases of Clan Pestilens is beyond compare, and he has unleashed many noisome plagues across the known world, ravaging civilizations and wiping out entire settlements. Warlord Queek Headtaker. Arqueek Headtaker is the personal champion of the ruler of Clan Moors, the most powerful of the rising Warlord Clans. Supremely confident of his own considerable abilities, and brave beyond any Skaven measure, Queek goes out of his way to find worthy opponents to challenge in hand-to-hand combat. He wears a trophy rack, displaying the remains of some of his most worthy foes, including the skull of Dwarf Lord Krug Ironhand of Carrick Draz, and the bones of Goblin War Boss Droskar. He has been the target of countless assassination attempts by rival warlords and jealous members of his own clan. But Queek seems to have an uncanny ability to survive these encounters and exact his brutal revenge. Grey Seer Thanquol. Thanquol is an extremely dangerous Grey Seer, who, employing the most devious tactics in true Skaven fashion, has quickly risen through the ranks of his order. His ruthlessness and cunning are only matched by his paranoia, characteristics that are very useful for a successful career among Skaven. His abilities have won him the favor of some of the Lords of Decay, as well as the enmity of others, and Thanquol has become one of the favorite agents of the Council of 13. Of course, the ambitious Grey Seer tends to use this influence to improve his own standing, and to enforce his own secret ploys, manipulating and misunderstanding the orders of the Council when he can exploit the situation in his favor. Thanquol's main field of expertise is humans, which of all the races in the old world he finds most interesting and easy to corrupt. His schemes and the full-scale assaults he has led against the nations of the old world have caused much death and destruction. But recently his plots seem to fail with an alarming regularity. The reason for this, apart from Skaven treachery, of course, has a name: Gotrek Gurnishin. The mighty dwarf slayer and his human companion Felix Jaeger have repeatedly found themselves in the way of the Grey Seer's plans. Up to now, they have managed to ruin his schemes and lived to tell the tale. The irritating way in which these two adventurers have escaped death at the hands of Thanquol's minions again and again is beginning to have a detrimental effect on the nerves of the Grey Seer. But Thanquol does not desist. Surely a wizard of his superior intellect will eventually prevail on such lowly opponents. And then he will march unopposed to ultimate power. Recently, as a gesture of reconciliation for past misunderstandings, important members of Clan Skryre have given a very special gift to Thanquol. The Warlock engineers hired Clan Eshinn adepts to retrieve the remains of Bone Ripper, Thanquol's first Rat Ogre bodyguard, from a museum in Nuln. They repaired the damage done to the creature's bones by Gotrek Gurnishin's rune axe, and used them as the frame for a powerful mechanical construct. Animated by Clan Skryre's dark sorcery, Bone Ripper has been born as a mindless, warpstone-powered killing machine, ready to obey Thanquol's orders. Throt the Unclean. The twisted and corpulent Throt the Unclean is one of the most powerful and influential members of Clan Moulder. As a result of the excessive contact with the pure warpstone he uses in his mad experiments, Throt has mutated over the years, in mind as well as body. Great spines of bone have sprouted from his back, and unnatural warpstone-fueled energy courses through his veins, suffusing his 3 arms with power. So great is his strength that he is capable of pinning the strongest rat ogre to the ground by the neck using his wickedly spiked creature killer. This unnatural energy ravages his system, however, and he requires constant sustenance to keep the energy from consuming him. Maddening hunger ceaselessly torments him, and he carries pouches stuffed with all manner of vile creatures he uses as foodstuffs. His left eye, torn from its socket in a struggle against a rival packmaster, has been replaced with a shard of warpstone, crudely hammered into place, feeding its twisting power directly into his fevered brain. Throt is one of the oldest living Skaven within Clan Moulder, second only to the clan's mysterious Lord of Decay. His lifespan has been extended far beyond its natural course by the manipulating effects of warpstone. Much of Clan Moulder is connected through the bloodline of Throt, for he has spawned literally hundreds of offspring, and they in turn have birthed countless litters. The ranks of Clan Moulder include so many generations of Throt's offspring that he has become something of a patriarch amongst the wealthy clan. Of course, as is the Skaven way, this bloodline conveys no hint of loyalty from his underlings, and he has slain countless numbers of his brood for plotting against him, or for posing a threat to his position. His power within the clan has often been undermined by his wary superiors sabotaging his experiments and scheming against him. Utterly consumed with his disturbing research, Throt has long since lost whatever hint of sanity he once had. His waking hours are filled with his twisted studies, and the depths of his domain echo with the cacophony of tortured cries from the living abominations dwelling there, the horrid results of his unnatural experiments. Cross-breeding all manner of creatures and utilizing the mutilating effects of warpstone, Throt is ever seeking to create more destructive creatures to set on his enemies and trade with other clans. In his sleep, his corrupted mind is filled with demented dreams, his mind plunging ever deeper within his insane delirium. Having spent some time in the far distant land of Lustria, Throt has formed a tense agreement with the Skaven of Clan Pestilens. Incorporating the Plague Monk's knowledge of disease and corruption into his own disturbed creations, Throt has created a mutated form of rat carrying a fast-acting, lethal contagion, which he has begun to breed within the Skaven underworld. It is rumored that Throt himself has contracted this disease, but that his warpstone-enhanced constitution has thus far kept it from overcoming him. Throt's latest obsession is his most ambitious project yet, inspired by witnessing some of the immense creatures dwelling within the tropical jungles of Lustria. His fevered, insanely brilliant mind is now consumed with creating a monstrous rat creature, mutated out of all proportion, so that it will tower over even the largest rat ogres. At the head of his storm vermin bodyguard, Grey Seer Arqueek proudly contemplated the vast army he had at his command. It seemed that even the gigantic cavern in which the battle was about to take place could hardly contain all the Skaven assembled there. Advancing as a living tide of mangy fur, the Skaven horde was rapidly closing the distance, separating it from the disciplined ranks of the enemy, the hated dwarf things. At the front of the Skaven line, the Grey Seer noticed crazed plague monks of Clan Pestilens breaking into a run. Foaming at the mouth, the deranged heralds of Pestilens charged towards the enemy too soon, showing no respect for the clever battle plan that the Grey Seer had devised. Fools, thought Arqueek. As the monks charged in, the dwarves opened fire. A volley of crossbow bolts and handgun bullets tore through the first ranks of the plague monks, cutting down many of the fanatics. They seemed oblivious to the casualties and trampled over the wounded in their mad lust to reach the enemy. A sinister hiss rose from the dwarf line as two of their war engines fired simultaneously. Two huge gouts of fire were projected through the air in a slow-moving arc, landing in the middle of the monks. The flames enveloped the devotees of Clan Pestilens with horrific results. Most of them died screaming in the blaze, but some of them kept charging, their robes and fur ablaze. They finally reached the dwarf line, where they managed to drag down several astonished dwarfs before the rest of the bearded warriors could cut them down. The Grey Seer was impressed by the ferocity displayed by the monks, and made a mental note never to displease their clan, if possible. Their savage charge had helped his plan after all. Attracting most of the dwarves' firepower, they had allowed the rest of the horde to reach the dwarves relatively unharmed. Large units of light-armed Skaven were now charging the dwarf warriors, clashing in bitter melee. The heavily armored dwarves formed a solid shield wall, their axes and hammers exacting a heavy toll on the ratmen. Here and there, though, a dwarf was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of his opponents, and was dragged down and torn to pieces. Where this happened, another dwarf warrior resolutely stepped in to close the gap in the shield wall, and the line held. After the initial ferocious assault, the Skaven quickly lost courage, broke and fled in disorder, too fast for the dwarves to follow. The Grey Seer observed the fleeing Skaven, and a smile formed on his lips. This first wave of attackers had been made up for the most part of enslaved clan rats, and had served its purpose of testing the dwarf defense. Even better, lying among the piles of dead slaves, he could see a decent number of dwarf things. The casualties were in the order of 10 to 1 in favor of the dwarves. Good. The fight was going unexpectedly well, thought Arqueek. The main regiments of the Skaven army were waiting just behind the large masses of fleeing slaves, and, at the Grey Seer's signal, started to move forward. This second wave was made up of many units of clan rat warriors, and several large packs of giant rats goaded into battle by clan Moulder packmasters. These were not the only beasts of Moulder present on the battlefield. Just in front of Arqueek's storm vermin, a line of massive rat ogres was unleashed against the dwarves. Surprised by the silence of the dwarves' war machines, the Seer extended his magical perception to examine the enemy artillery. His spirit pulled free from his body and rose above the fighting, crossing the entire battlefield in a flash, to finally focus on the enemy's gun emplacements. He soon realized that the diversion created by the slaves had served a double purpose, allowing Clan Eshinn's adepts to sneak their way to the back of the dwarf line and attack the cannons. The dwarves manning the guns put up a brave fight, but were soon dispatched by the poised blades of the gutter runners. Good, thought the Grey Seer. Now the lethal adepts of Clan Eshinn would attack the dwarf line from the back and rout their missile troops completely. In his mind's eye, Arqueek saw the gutter runners hurl a flurry of poisoned throwing stars into a regiment of dwarf thunderers. But then, when the surviving dwarves turned around to return fire, the black-clad Eshinn warriors turned tail and disappeared. "The cowards!" thought the Grey Seer, outraged. Or maybe they were just being too literal about their orders, he wondered. Perhaps, with the elimination of the dwarf artillery, the gutter runners decided that they had earned their fee and left before having to suffer too many casualties. Arqueek would have a word with their leader after the battle. Grey Seer Arqueek turned his attention back to the action in front of him, where the rat ogres had almost made contact with the dwarf line. This time the fight was very different. On the left and right flank, the clan rats and giant rats were holding their own against the dwarves. Their efforts in breaching the enemy's shield wall were helped by small units of Clan Skryre globadiers. These specialist troops wore strange protective masks and were armed with glass globes filled with deadly poison gas. Their weapons killed many bearded ones, together with quite a few Skaven when one of the globes missed its target or landed in the thick of the fight. That didn't matter, thought Arqueek. The dwarves were like a small island in a vast sea of brown fur. The Skaven Seer had to admit that the dwarf things were fighting well, and he could see that the battle still hung in the balance. Then the charge of the rat ogres hit home. The great beasts tore their way through the dwarf line with pleasing ease. The dwarf warriors were lifted in the air and quartered by the slashing claws of Clan Moulder's feral monsters. If a dwarf axe managed to penetrate the tough hide of one of the rat ogres, the wounded beast would just fight more ferociously, continuing the slaughter with renewed fury. The packmasters simply walked behind their creatures, stopping only to slit the throat of the few dwarves that had only been wounded by the rat ogres. Under such an onslaught, the dwarf morale finally gave way, and they ran, pursued by the ravenous monsters. The storm vermin rushed forward to take advantage of the gap opened by the rat ogres in the enemy line, following in the wake of Clan Moulder's powerful war beasts. The Grey Seer and his bodyguards had to step over the broken bodies of many Skaven and dwarf things. Arqueek was convinced that the battle was won. Soon he would be feasting on the dwarf lord's entrails. Right in front of the rat ogres, a mighty battle cry rang loud. A new regiment of dwarves had entered the fray. Charging forward from the back of the dwarf line, the Seer was sure that he had seen no troops held in reserve. This new unit had probably just arrived on the site of the battle. These dwarves were different from all the others. They wore no armor, were covered in tattoos, and all their fur had been dyed bright orange or red. Slayers. Arqueek was very close to squirting the musk of fear as he remembered the accounts that Grey Seer Thanquol had given to the council of the battle prowess of these mad, death-seeking dwarves. He immediately ordered the storm vermin to halt, hurling themselves towards the rat ogres. The slayers caught the large creatures unprepared. It was unusual for them to be attacked with such reckless ferocity. The dim-witted beasts were used to inspiring fear in their enemies, but these ones were different, and the monsters were puzzled, almost afraid. The Grey Seer couldn't believe his own eyes, as the rat ogres were cut down one by one. Arqueek was particularly concerned about a huge slayer wielding a massive hammer encrusted in glowing runes. Every irresistible strike of the weapon pulverized the skull of another rat ogre. A few badly wounded rat ogres fought back viciously, eviscerating many of the slayers before finally succumbing to the dwarves' axes. The others turned to flee, trampling the Moulder packmasters who vainly tried to keep them in the fight with their whips. The dwarves started to pursue the mutated monsters, but catching sight of the Skaven general's storm vermin bodyguard, changed direction and ran towards the elite enemy, bellowing guttural challenges. The Seer was about to order a prudent tactical retreat when he remembered the Skryre rattling gun he had hired to support his storm vermin. If the new machine was half as good as the Warlock engineers promised.
"Fire! Fire!"
ordered Arqueek, pointing at the slayers. The Skryre weapon team aimed their multi-barreled gun at the dwarves and activated the warp-stone gas pump that powered the weird machine. The weapon's first burst cut a red swath through the dwarves, slowing their advance. The Skryre engineers started to cackle maniacally, turning wildly on the crank that raised the rate of fire of the machine to augment the already impressive rain of death. More and more slayers were sent to meet their maker. Grey Seer Arqueek was impressed. The weapon was certainly worth the astronomical price he had paid for it. Then suddenly something went wrong. With a high-pitched whistle, a leak appeared in the canisters fueling the gun's pump, and a huge green scalding cloud surrounded the weapon team. Screams of pain reached Arqueek, and he saw that the weapon was still firing. But the crew had lost all control over the direction they were firing in. The weapon's bursts drew a semicircular arc on the ground around the rattling gun and reached the terrified storm vermin. Many of the elite warriors were gunned down before the machine finally exploded, vaporizing the crew. Those treacherous fools had obviously sold him a flawed machine. The sorcerer was covered in the blood of his bodyguards. Someone was going to pay for that. The Grey Seer had to abandon his plans of revenge when he realized that he had far more pressing problems to hand. The few slayers left, led by the terrifying one with the runic hammer, were almost upon him. Arqueek raised a paw and pointed it towards the slayers, chanting words of power as he evoked a powerful spell against the dwarves. A green glow pulsated around his claws, and then fizzled into nothingness. To his surprise, the Skaven felt that an external force was fighting his magic, coming from somewhere in the dwarf line. That couldn't be. He was a powerful Grey Seer. Surely he couldn't be defeated by one of those old dwarves and their trivial rune magic. Arqueek quickly scoffed a piece of warpstone and soon felt the power surging through his entire being. It was an exhilarating sensation, and the Grey Seer savored it deeply before unleashing his new power against the dwarves. This time there was nothing the runesmith could do to stop the green lightning erupting from Arqueek's outstretched paw. The slayers, now a few meters away, were hit by the warp lightning and died where they stood, consumed by the evil energy that arced from one dwarf to the other, melting their flesh and charring their bones. A satisfied growl emerged from the Seer's throat as his enemies burned. Soon, all that was left of the slayers were a few smoking husks. That's how it should be. All his enemies were going to suffer the same fate. First these pathetic dwarf things, and later the fools that sold him the malfunctioning rattling gun, and those cowardly gutter runners. Much to Arqueek's dismay, The hammer-wielding slayer picked himself up from the ground, his body covered in horrible blisters, his hair completely burned away. Before the surprised gray seer realized what was going on, the slayer was upon them. The dwarf, his face mad with fury, headed resolutely towards the hated Skaven, felling a storm vermin at every step. "Kill! Kill!" shouted Arqueek desperately to his bodyguards, trying frantically to push behind the ranks of armored Skaven warriors. Then he stumbled on a corpse and fell to the ground. A few storm vermin stepped forward to protect him, but the Slayer's hammer quickly dispatched them. The crazed dwarf reached the gray seer and raised his mighty weapon for the killing blow. Paralyzed by terror, all that the Skaven could do was stare at the rune-encrusted hammer about to descend on him. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the Skaven wizard. A cloaked figure had emerged out of nowhere and leapt to interpose itself between the dwarf and the gray seer. The mysterious figure was wielding a pair of wicked daggers that he plunged, blades crossed, into the base of the Slayer's neck. The dwarf looked puzzled, as if he could not understand what had just happened. Then, with a vicious, scissoring action, the black-robed Skaven pulled the blades outwards, and the head of the Slayer fell to the floor with a sinister thud. Turning towards the gray seer, the Eshinn assassin smiled enigmatically, revealing a set of vicious fangs. He spoke in a grim, hissing voice. "Gray seer, my masters trust your plan. They don't want you dead today. Get up and finish the dwarf things. Do not let us down, gray seer." With that, the assassin darted back through the ranks of surprised storm vermin and disappeared in the confusion of battle, leaving behind a very perplexed gray seer Arqueek, his heart just starting to slow down. After many hours of bitter fighting, the weary seer was at last witnessing his great plan coming to fruition. The huge numbers of the Skaven had prevailed, and eventually overwhelmed the dwarf defenses. Their shield wall broken, one after the other the stubborn dwarf regiments had been surrounded and massacred by the ratmen. Only one unit of the dwarf things still remained. Heavily armed warriors with high crested helmets and huge warhammers were putting up a stalwart last stand with their backs to the gigantic doors that were the entrance to their ancestral home. In their midst, Arqueek easily recognized the leader of the enemy, a grim dwarf whose armor and axe were so encrusted with runes that the Skaven's eyes ached just to look upon him. Several times the savage charge of the clan rats had broken against these elite warriors, and now the situation had come to a standstill. The dwarves were surrounded and outnumbered 100 to 1, but the clan rats were hesitating. They didn't dare get too close to those lethal warhammers. Arqueek was furious. Surely he had been given command of the most cowardly troops in the Under Empire. He had run out of warpstone, and his magic would now struggle to affect the dwarves massed around their protective runic banner. He decided instead to vent his frustration by blasting a few Skaven to smithereens, as an example of what happened to those who disobeyed his orders, and to inspire a bit of courage in his underlings. As the Skaven sorcerer scanned his troops for suitable victims, his eyes fell on the last surviving regiment of slaves. He noticed that they were unusually cheerful, and suddenly remembered the promise he had made to the slaves in his inspiring speech before the battle.
Fight the dwarf things. Freedom to all who survive.
Those slaves had fought well indeed, and he was now annoyed by the fact that he should now free them. A feral gleam touched his eyes as a solution formed in Arqueek's mind. The Grey Seer was pleased that, as usual, his mighty intellect had conceived the perfect way to get rid of both these last enemies and the overconfident slaves. The Seer of the Horned Rat raised his claws high above his head and started chanting a prayer to his foul god. A dark billowing cloud rose from the ground and covered the entire unit of slaves. As the Skaven inhaled the vapors, their cheers of hope for the freedom promised to them were transformed into snarls of barely contained bloodlust. Some of the slaves started hacking at each other to satisfy the desperate desire to kill that had got hold of their minds. Rising to his full stature, the Grey Seer pointed towards the last dwarf defenders, ordering in a booming voice,
"Them! Get them!"
With a ferocious roar, the slaves charged the dwarves, their small red eyes filled with fury. The leader of the storm vermin turned towards his superior to express his doubts.
"O most honorable eminency, many clan rats die. What can slaves do?"
With a wicked smile on his lips, Arqueek answered in a whisper,
"What can slaves do? They keep dwarf things busy for just enough time. All warp fire throwers fire! Quick!
A respectful expression appeared on the storm vermin's face as understanding struck him. The armored ratman bowed low and answered,
Yes. O most clever elf.